My name is Roussell, and I'm the co-curator of the exhibition Civilization, the Way We Live Now. Thank you so much to the Musée de San Domenico and the Festival de Bon Vivere for having us here today. I won't repeat everything that we discussed yesterday or earlier in the morning panel, but I will just remind some of the key ideas of the exhibition before I invite the photographers onto the stage. Civilization, the Way We Live Now, has as its subject contemporary 21st century planetary civilization. The exhibition and the book focus on what's shared, the cumulative and the collective human endeavor that's given rise to the most complex society the world has ever seen. This exhibition was conceived as a traveling exhibition, and it includes the work of more than 130 photographers, and it's been designed as a journey using 8 chapters. The structure of the exhibition was not something we decided in advance. It emerged organically during the selection of photographs over a number of years. These sections are meant to be poetic and suggestive. They're meant to represent key ideas that we identified from the artistic projects. And I want to highlight this idea of the artistic projects, because as much as the show explores ideas about planetary civilization, it's very much a show about photography itself. And it's a show about how photography deals with the current world, and how photographers have taken a portrait of our contemporary civilization. So on this panel, we'll be focusing on this aspect in particular. How do photographers work? Maybe for some of you, it's a bit of a mystery. As curators, we sometimes get that backstage pass and access to talk with them about how they produce a project, what their personal interests are, what are their inspirations. And so today we'd like to give you a bit of that chance. Each of the 300 photographs in the exhibition are part of a series. They're not one picture. We've pulled that picture out of its context and given it a new one. And we're appreciative to the photographers for letting us do that. In the exhibition, there's a wide range of artistic styles. We're presenting artists at the beginning of their career, as well as mid-career, and very well-established names. And some of them are here with us today, so we're very appreciative. There are photojournalists, conceptual artists, documentary photographers, commercial photographers, and artists working with image, text, and textile. We're really representing a range of contemporary image practices. Since photography was invented, photographers have gone everywhere and photographed everything. It's perhaps even truer today as technology, travel, and communication bring them quicker and closer to the subject that they want to capture. And it's finally important to remember, I'll repeat a point that Bill mentioned this morning, that photography is cumulative, like civilization is cumulative. Photographers study the medium's history, they respect it, and they build upon it. So, I am now going to invite the photographers who are going to be on the panel to the stage. Ludovica Bastianini, if you could come up. Andreia Cercic. Nicola BERTASI. Sean Hemmerly. And Lois Connor. And I'd also like to invite up Luke Kemp, who's going to join us in the middle of our panel. Can you sit actually there? Sorry. So as I mentioned, to start off the conversation, we'd like to give you the opportunity to talk about your work, to talk about your creative process, and to give our audience some insight into how you perceive photographs, how you think about images, how you work in projects, and what you love about photography. So some of the questions that you can kind of keep in your mind as you're talking about your work. How are you making a photograph? How are you devising and producing your projects? What is your thought process like? And finally, what are some of the challenges that you face? And I'll come back to each of you through the conversation, but I thought just to start off, it could be nice to have the questions in mind. So I'd like to start with, let's start with Nicola, if you're willing. So Nicola has joined is an Italian artist, and he joined Civilization for the edition here in Italy in Forlì with a very interesting project, Pandemic Postcards and Pandemic Papers, that he made during the COVID-19 pandemic from his home. And so I thought, Nicola, if you'd like to start, you could give us a bit of an introduction to how you think about photography, how you're working with images, and maybe talk a little bit about your current work.
Pandemic Postcards, the project that it's shown here in the exhibition, it's part of a bigger project, Pandemic Papers, and it's a project where I didn't make I didn't take photographs by myself. It's a collage project. I work with archives. I found these incredible archives about the Spanish flu in the 1917, 18, and 20, and I start to thinking about to make a project where the time is flu also, and we can read the pandemics we were living through the lens of the past. So I made this collage, this kind of materic and digital collage. I think we are looking to another project because you asked me to show other images than the one. This is a work, it's called Like Rain Falling from the Sky. It's a work that I made from 2016 until 2020 in Vietnam. It's a work about the memory of the conflicts of the American war in Vietnam. And in this project, I start to work with archives. It was my first time I approached this style. And my interest was to mix my images with the images of the past and documents and archives, to try to tell a story in not in a linear way, but in a way where past and present were mixed together.
And so in this project, this is about Agent Orange, right? This is part of
not only, it's divided in 3 chapters, but it's about the memory of the war. Yeah. What remains in the territory 40 years after the struggles. Yes, and the idea was to find signs of the war in the territory a lot of time after the war itself, but the war remains.
And so in the pandemic postcards, it's a slightly different approach because here you traveled extensively to Vietnam, you photographed, and then in the final project, well, it's still in the process of its final iteration, this project on Vietnam. But in pandemic postcards, you were not able to go outside. You were not able to go photograph anything. So how did you work while you were at home? How did you get access also to archives? Were you using purely digital archives, or did you already have some archival photographs at home with you?
Okay, the first things, I was like everyone here. I think I was a lot confused because it was the first days of the beginning of this pandemic that was a change of our life for everybody, epochal. And I didn't have the necessity to go out and take photographs. I didn't feel that. I wanted to make research, and I did that, and I found these incredible archives on the net, and on the net, actually from the U.S. National Archives, so it's for everybody. And from that, I start to thinking how I can tell a story from today, but with the help of the past. And so this is the way the 10 postcards born. Each postcard have an history, different types of languages and things, and so this is the way it born the project. Then each postcard, it takes to me like 3-4 weeks to finalize. So it was a long work because the collage, then it was long, and to find the good way in an aesthetical way, but also in conceptual. So it was a long work. It's small, but each postcard is...
Yeah. Well, I think it's very interesting, you know, how you, the use of archival images is a kind of very important part today of the contemporary photography community and also photography books. And I think it's interesting, you know, working with that archive and going, that's how you go out into the world and you find inspiration to talk about history and memory, which is quite different than other artists on this panel. And I think that's one of the reasons I was pretty excited actually at the mix of people we have here, because your practices are quite different. I'd like to maybe ask Sean. I'm going to start with a quote, I apologize, from you, that I think kind of sets the tone a bit for how you go out into the world maybe and find inspiration. You can correct me if I'm wrong. This is from the Civilization book. At the end of the publication, there's a section where we invited anyone who would like to contribute an artist statement to write about their work, to write about the photographs in the project, but also to write about how they approach this idea of civilization, how they see it. So, Sean, you said, "I take pictures to understand the world around me. Photographs help me to digest events that in the moment are too dynamic to comprehend immediately. Each frame or sequence of images is a small homage to the moment lived." So, I'm wondering if you'd like to share a bit with us about your practice.
I did say that.
That's good.
I did. That's correct. I had more time to think about that answer than I have now. I typed that out and went over it. When I met my wife, I'd been going to a couple war zones. The picture that I have in the show here is from the 12th of September. It's in Manhattan. And it's inside Brooks Brothers, looking out through the window. The South Tower, the tip of it is like stuck in the ground. And that picture changed my career in a way that I hadn't expected. Suddenly everybody wanted to publish it. And so then I made a bunch of money off it that felt strange to make money off of that. So I went to Afghanistan with the profits that I made from that. And I'd never been to Asia before. I'd been to Mexico, and I was in the army, so I'd been to Germany. But the pictures that are up here are they're basketball hoops. After Afghanistan, I went to Baghdad because that's where my country was going, and I didn't agree then. I don't agree now with our foreign policy in those ways. But while I was waiting to meet with someone, I was standing on this big open area, and I saw a basketball hoop. And then when these MPs showed up, I said, "Hey, did you guys put that basketball hoop up?" And they said, "What basketball hoop?" And I said, "That one." And they're like, "Oh, no, that's Iraqi." So it occurred to me then that there were other forms of American diplomacy that had succeeded perhaps better than what we do with guns. And then I photographed basketball hoops all over the place. And I photographed a basketball hoop in Venice 2 days ago that was really great. And on the notion of like on process, I used to photograph things that really pissed me off because I felt that like when when I came back, well, when I was watching what was happening in Afghanistan, I didn't agree with what was going on. And I thought that was, like, we were saying things like, we're going to bomb that country back to the Stone Age. And that was a prevalent thought. It's perhaps still a prevalent thought among certain people. So I wanted to go and see it for myself and bring back pictures. I did the same thing in Iraq, and I brought back the idea that maybe we could do this differently. And it was wildly unpopular at the time. But I was bent on changing people's opinions on these things. But I've changed. I have 2 children now, 4 and 7 years old, and they fill me with joy. So I'm trying to take photographs now that express joy and that maybe bring more joy into the world. That seems ridiculous, I know, but that's sort of where I am now.
Well, thank you. Lois, I wonder if we could transition to you. Lois has had a long and really incredible career. I think you said yesterday 38 years traveling back and forth between China and the United States or wherever else you were going, visiting China almost every year since 1984. And I'm wondering, what is it that inspires you to go out and photograph? You talk about your subject as landscape as culture, and I'm wondering kind of how does that day begin for you? How do you?
When you're my age, you have a long history, and I didn't want to go too far back, but I apprenticed to an artist, a painter, when I was 13. I didn't even know what that meant, but we moved to Pennsylvania, and we lived next door to an artist, so I asked my parents, and I started to paint. And he was a landscape painter, so we took these long walks out in the woods, and we painted. And I really felt like I learned how to respond with a paintbrush. And it kind of changed my way of looking at the world. And then skipped forward a lot of years, and art history became really important to me. I was interested in learning about the history of the world through art. I mean, I did start working at the UN at age 20, so it just kind of coincided with those things. And I worked at the UN for 13 years. And I finished my undergraduate and graduate school while I was there. I learned how to program computers, But my job didn't have anything to do with photography. But I was really inspired by the world through the people I met there, and through the news and I'm witnessing real events that are in the news, reading the news, and didn't exactly happen like that, but that's interesting. And so art history, in the beginning, it was the work of Constable and Van Gogh that inspired me to go to France and England, and I didn't want to make their work. I mean, this looks like it's not even relevant, but I have to find some place to establish myself. And they got me to those places, and so I'm not trying to make paintings, but photography, from when I was an undergraduate, I had to take a class with the view camera. And before that, I thought it was more like Cartier-Bresson, and I should be running around with a small camera and really quick. And that wasn't my aesthetic. That's why painting was so perfect for me, because I just could sit and observe. So with the view camera, the camera has to be on the tripod, and it gave me permission to pause, to stare, to wonder, to be thrilled about the world. And moving the camera 1 inch or 30 feet or climb a mountain, it was the right tool for me. That's why one should experiment. I still make paintings, but I really, I love the view camera. It's, now these are all 7/17" negatives, and the ones that are longer or multiples, I couldn't even show the ones, you know, I have like, you know, 5-panel, 10-panel ones, because I'm really interested in that whole continuum of the landscape. But I still want each picture to work individually.
There was
so the way I got to China, I'm going to get there. So when I was a graduate student, I had to take 3 electives, and I took all my electives in art history. And just to be wild, I thought, well, I'll just take a class in Chinese landscape painting. And I went to the class, and everybody spoke Chinese. They knew what they were looking at, and they were also graduate students. I was a graduate student too. But I was completely intimidated, and at the end of the class, the first class, I asked the professor if I could drop the class. He says, absolutely not. And I'm like, oh my God, the sweat, you know. And he said, you'll bring, you know, another point of view, and it'll stimulate them to say, you know, to think in different ways. And so I took the class, and, you know, we were looking at some Ming painting one day of the landscape of, well, these sort of Dr. Seuss-like mountains, or the mountains kind of looked like an electron photomicrograph of the human tongue. They didn't really look like mountains. They aren't mountains. But I was bold enough to ask why they made up these mountains like this. And he said, well, it's a place that really exists. It's the Guilin area in China, in southern China, Guangxi province. So I was determined to one day go there. So it was like 1981. And 1982, I started using the 717 camera. Before that, I was using the more classic shape at the 8x10. And in 1984, I got a Guggenheim Fellowship, and I went to China for 9 months, not knowing that 38 years later, I'm still going to be going to China, trying to answer the questions that I had. You know, it's like when you start, it's just like there is no end. And concurrently with photographing, this is Tibet, in China, it made me look at my world differently. You know, the world I grew up in America. I've traveled to every state in America. I've driven across country 8 times in my truck camping, and I feel like my studio is the world. I traveled to all the countries that touch China because I felt like, and I've traveled all around the interior of China, because I feel like, how can I really talk about the Guilin landscape without knowing what China is, what Asia is, and those are the questions that I keep asking. I know that was too long-winded. I was just going to say I'm a landscape photographer, period.
I'm very biased. I'd love to hear your China stories all day, so I was I'll let you continue talking as long as you want. No, it's very interesting, and I like how this idea of stillness, you know, that you found finally the right camera and the right, I'm not going to start talking about, you mentioned yesterday, I maybe want to come back to this. You mentioned that you felt that black and white was right for you because it allowed allowed you to express this fact and fiction that's very important in your work. I'm going to come back to it though, because I'd like to just let Andreas maybe introduce a little bit his work. And I was thinking of this idea of stillness that Lois evoked in kind of finding the right technique, finding the right way to approach her work. The image that we have from you in the exhibition is a photograph from Detroit. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, in your work, there's this interest in these places of transit, transition, and that kind of, there is a certain stillness and almost a neutrality in that gaze. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the series that the image in the exhibition comes from, and also if you want to talk about what interests you in photography, and how are you exploring a representation of the world through your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the image is from a long-term series, Periphere, it's called. So, as the title says, it's like, let's say, suburban, urban places around the world. And I think I'm influenced or marked by, I think, go back to my childhood, because I grew up in in a small Swiss town where they said that the best days are over. Even, of course, compared to like other countries, it's ridiculous. But still, you grow up with this feeling. And I already, in the beginning, I experimented also with painting and did black and white series in my hometown, because this topic of these, let's call them non-places, was always there, and I was like researching what are they defined by, and I think it's more they're more defined by what is missing than what there is or what there can be seen, and it still fascinates me because I still don't know where I can find these places, because I think it's about the feeling I'm looking for. It's a feeling you have in such places. I think everybody knows these places, even if they haven't been there. So it's kind of like it's also like a collective feeling there is about these places. Yes.
A bit interesting also that we talked about before. I don't want to go too technical, but I think that sometimes when we look at your image, it's maybe something that we don't perceive immediately at first glance. And it's that some of these images, they're composites that you're actually constructing to create this particular gaze.
Well, the thing is, well, I don't want to go too far back, but it's in the end, it's a digital montage of like 7 to 9 or more medium format negatives, but not with the idea to manipulate or add something different to the place, just to actually to be as close as possible to the human gaze. Because the thing was, if I would like make the photograph with because it's quite a wide crop, so it's not a panorama, but it's a wide crop, and I would need a extreme wide angle to catch it, and but I don't want to have an image like generated by a machine. So I can stay with my montage technique and can kind of stay closer to the human eye, because I don't have to distort as much as a machine would do. Yes, and I think this, yes, creates also a certain I don't know how to call it. They're not really correct in some sense, but still it's the place there was, and because on one hand, my approach is really to that the viewer can experience the place as I did when I was there. So I don't want to like color-wise or add something, because I don't think I had to add anything. I think I've kind of, I don't know if I find this place, maybe the places find me, but that's not the question. But I don't think I have to add anything, because they tell so much about how they were constructed, how they, yeah, and I just want to show them as they are. Yeah, because they tell a lot of stories. Yeah.
No, thank you. I think it's really, I know you said you didn't want to talk too much about technique, but I think it is interesting to bring it up, because I imagine maybe a number of people, when they look at the photographs, they don't anticipate it, because I think you do really successfully recreate what feels like a very natural gaze. And I wanted to bring it up because it's something that's very, I think, as curators, we tend to be very curious people. And we want to know everything. You know, first we want to look at as many images as we can. I always ask, can I see more? Can you show me more pictures? I don't want to see just your selection. I want to see all of them. And then in addition to that, very curious about how did you make them? Why did you make them? And so thank you for indulging me and going into a little bit of the technical details. And I think that something very exciting in contemporary photography is how a lot of younger artists are also experimenting with different forms. How can they arrive at communicating the concept that they have in mind, at the feeling that they have in mind, through their use of the image? And so I'd like to invite Ludovica to talk a little bit about her work. Ludovica joined the exhibition also here in Forlì. She's based out of Naples. And she has in the exhibition a project that she completed during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a diary, which I think is a really interesting body of work. It's very powerful, and it also is representative of an important trend in recent years of photography books. And the final project actually, you know, when I asked Ludovica how she wanted to show it in Forlì, she said, well, I conceived it as a book, so I think we should look at it as a book. I said, okay, we'll look at it as a book. And I think it's important that we recognize that for a number of artists, and also sometimes for Nicola, the object is not a photographic print. It's going to be something else entirely. And that's an interesting evolution, I think, in photography that we can also recognize. So Ludovica, would you like to talk a little bit about your work?
Yes, thank you. And yeah, I actually don't work that much with the street photography and the big prints, and I think this depends mostly because of my education, since I wasn't very interested in photography until my Erasmus in Barcelona. I was already 24, and I was studying history of art actually, and I discovered recently more about, the will behind art that is characteristic of each time. So I was studying a lot about languages in general, and my path wasn't only about the official languages, so the beautiful sculpture or paintings, but about every document that we can find, which may be something very vernacular, like dishes or objects. I am actually also working with small objects at the moment, combining them with photography. And that's because during my practice, which started more with painting and illustrations, I became very interested in the photographic image when I felt the power of a realistic image, which introduces details of reality, but not the full reality, and it can be manipulated and changed. It can be directed to express a certain message. And so this journal during the pandemic was a very spontaneous attempt of understanding all the messages, which was crazy because it's impossible. But I was very overwhelmed, like everybody. It was actually difficult to me. So I didn't approach in a very scientific way, like I am studying the time. But I was stealing everything I could, also taking my own photograph in the house. And I was taking any information I could, like, this is a history lesson from the Spanish flu, so trying to make some comparison with history, photographing the street outside, also taking documents from the internet, from people, photograph I received from my sister in the hospital, and she was working in intensive care. And she could send me something, not so much because they weren't allowed to bring any device inside the rooms. And I was also taking, jokes, meme, anything which could express the moment, not only news, official news, but also fake news, confusional messages, and anything could transmit a feeling of the society. I think there is a issue with mass media communication at the moment. We are really inside photographic images all the time. And I think it's difficult today to understand which language you can use to really give a message. So it's no more so easy, because we see any kind of image, even video during the news. Maybe you're eating and you're looking at images from the war. And I think this is somehow, it takes away some sensitivity from us. So I think my research is about trying to find again the sensitivity somewhere, somehow.
And so for the project, you can see we've been able to project quite a bit of it here, but it's also in the exhibition. There are 2 books that you can look at and also take some time to read through if you'd like. I think it's so this project was born out of the situation of COVID-19 in Italy, when you were unable to leave your apartment, you didn't have access to probably a studio, other materials, to go taking photographs. And so I'd like to transition a little bit to that question of access, which is sometimes perhaps something that we don't think about when we're looking at a photograph, but often there's a lot that happens behind the scenes, maybe years of work, maybe years of preparation, negotiation. And so I wanted to ask Sean, because I'm particularly interested in the photograph, the Brooks Brothers photograph from 9/11. How did you get access? And I mean, that must have been a really difficult day to be there. And I'm wondering kind of if you could tell us a bit about that situation and how are you able to take that photograph?
I went down, having watched the towers fall, I talked to a friend. I didn't know what to do. I was just sort of home, frozen. And I talked to a friend in Germany. He said, you have to do something. So I don't really have another skill set. I'm not a bad father, but I didn't have that skill set then. So I just grabbed my cameras and went to the city thinking that I would get in to the like it was an exclusion area. And they had just set up another round of security. So there was the National Guard, and inside of the National Guard there were police, and then once past the police there was sort of nothing. But there were like roving cops, and I had walked around the whole thing like 3 times. I was nearly exhausted. It was late, and this woman that I'd never met before, she had 2 Leicas. So I knew that she was serious, and I had put my stuff sort of into the bag, and because I was trying to think, if I go in there and I have cameras out, they'll stop me. So I said, hide your Leicas. And so she put them under her coat, and she said, we should just walk in talking. If we just talk, no one they won't recognize us as trespassers. And so we were just casually speaking as we went in, and nobody stopped us. So we just walked in, and then we volunteered with the Salvation Army and worked for them for a couple of hours, handing out water. And then this woman who was sort of my boss there, she handed me some pallets, and she said, these need to go around the corner, which was where like the smoke was coming from. And I knew what she was saying, and she knew what she was saying. So I grabbed my bag, and I walked around the corner, and it was a landscape I knew well. I was very familiar with it. It was totally different. But most of my career can sort of be summed up into trespassing. That was like my gig for a long time. I would get magazine assignments in New York City because I would just go and make the pictures. I didn't set up anything. I've never asked for permission. I would just trespass. After 9/11, that was a really different game. And so now I oftentimes even ask for permission. But it's always easier to beg forgiveness often easier to beg forgiveness than get permission to do anything. So I photographed in Detroit a lot, and I didn't get anyone's permission to photograph. I take that back. The Detroit Theater, the former Detroit Theater, that's now a parking lot, I asked a lady who was working a parking lot, I was like, I want to go in there and photograph. She said, you can't do that. I'm like, well, why not? It's a really brilliant space. I've not seen a good photograph of it. And she's like, well, what are you doing? And so I'm doing this whole project on the Rust Belt, and it sort of starts here. And she was like, I'll give you 5 minutes. And I had like 35 minutes. And when I was done, I was really done. I'd shot everything that I'd ever thought that I might want to do there. But I always, people often ask me this, like, how do you get into those places? I went to Afghanistan with like $5,000. $3,000 of it was in my shoe. I was fleeced for $2,000 of it as soon as I got to Islamabad. It was just like a series of unfortunate events. But I just sort of pushed through. And I think like that sort of determination, or even just stupidity, really, is very helpful. If you don't stop to think, well, God, what's going to happen when this goes down? And just continue on, because luck favors the well-prepared.
I appreciate the honesty. I'm going to ask if we can not put this talk online afterwards so you can continue sneaking into places. discreetly for the future. I wanted to ask Lois, so I think as Sean has kind of highlighted for us, as a photographer, there are other skills that maybe sometimes a painter or a sculptor, they don't necessarily have to have. You're managing people, resources, finance, weather, governments, I don't know. And Lois, I'm kind of curious, because of the length of time that you've been working in China, in particular, I'm wondering if it was always, if you're always able to get access, if there was a time that it was more difficult and now it's easier, was there ever any fluctuation or something? I don't know, I'm kind of wondering if there's a moment that stands out.
I'm going to use a Chinese phrase here. Tian ma fan. Every day, there's something
Very
unpredictable. But
problematic.
I would say that's true for me photographing in New York too, and you know, on the road around America, you know, in Europe, you know, all the places. But in China, you could always guarantee there would be something. But it's, you know, I like the challenge of all that. You know, the challenge of the weather, you know, you can look at the weather and see what you think it might be or read the weather report, but it doesn't always end up being that thing. And I don't not go out because it's raining. I love the rain. I love, you know, that articulation of the moisture in the air is, you know, even better than shallow depth of field. You know, you see things in ways you haven't looked at it before. I just think that every time you go out, it's a brand new day. And, you know, I get permission when I can, and when I can't, I see how far I can push. And, you know, my Chinese isn't that good, but it's good enough, you know. A lot of times I've been stopped by the police, and they say, well, you can't photograph here. And I'm like, why not? And they go like, there's the police station. And I'm like, well, I'm photographing that way. And so, you know, it's good to have a language to be able to communicate. Otherwise, you know, you wouldn't understand what they said, and then you might miss the opportunity, you know. Is that enough? I mean, I could go on and on, but yeah.
It's a good answer. So I'd like to actually, since we still have a bit of time, I wanted to, so after the morning conversation, we discussed a bit with Luke, and I thought it would be interesting, because we did talk a bit about access this morning, and how photographers are working, and I thought Luke could maybe jump in our conversation a little bit, with some of the thoughts that you shared with me about this question of how people are working and access.
Yeah, so some brief reflections on the issue of access. It's interesting how much this reflects some key trends we see in kind of modern day society globally. So one is, I think we had mentioned earlier, this idea that people are much more sensitive now about their photograph being taken. And I couldn't help but link that to the idea of surveillance capitalism. Is anyone familiar with that term? So surveillance capitalism is the idea that many of the key industries of today are reliant upon the large-scale and often unconsenting use of data. And so when you actually look at the top 10 markets, top 10 firms by market capitalization, it's like 6 of them are all big data firms. So Google, Tencent, Apple, etc. And so in a way, it's very natural that people, of course, are now much more sensitive about the use of their own data, whether their photos being taken, etc., etc. So I see this as being a reflection of actually it's kind of a much larger trend that we're talking about. And likewise, the actual issue of access and the fact that sometimes you have to be careful whether the police or military might curtail your access is probably related to this very similar idea of what people call guard capitalism, which is as societies become increasingly unequal, they start to rely more and more upon a coercive apparatus. And so you see this in the US, the actual amount of people employed as security guards or in the police force or in military has basically skyrocketed as a percentage of the overall workforce. And so once again, the issue of access in a way is really emblematic, and these real life examples are emblematic of a much bigger and wider trend. An interesting connection here as well is I think Ludovica's work on COVID-19, just how quickly things evolved and spiraled. And one thing people often don't discuss is that COVID-19, in terms of going from the emergence of the disease through to its global spread, is, as far as we know, essentially the quickest pandemic in existence. And that's not just emblematic of that particular disease and its R rate, it's really about the fact that the world is so interconnected now. And you obviously see that in your work as well. We have people traveling to Vietnam, China and Tibet, etc. And the pathogen travels in exactly the same way as humans do. So I guess it's also the issue of interconnectivity alongside access. I wanted to quickly also just have a few brief reflections on the idea of the cumulative nature of both photography and civilization. And Bill had this very wonderful metaphor of the onion. I like to have a much more academic and wanky metaphor of what's called a palimpsest. So a palimpsest is essentially a text where it starts to fade and you write over the top of it. And many of the historical texts are exactly like that. So they've actually been written over the top of 3 or 4 times, and they still have the traces of the old text underneath. And I think in a way that's more apt, because first of all, the images of the past that we have are often emblematic of only a very small portion of what happened. So if you look at archives, for instance, most of the archives that we have historically were written by scribes who were basically in the employ of kings and elites. They weren't a very emblematic or representative image of history. And most archives historically have been destroyed. We actually only have a very small sliver of the archives that actually were available once. And it's interesting to think about what from this exhibition is actually going to last in the long term, particularly if we do have like a global crisis, for instance. And secondly is that the cumulative nature is also representative and reflective of power. So Sean, I really liked your example here of the basketball hoop as diplomacy. And I was talking to Holly over lunch about how when we look at architecture, particularly when we look at parliamentary buildings, these are supposed to be bastions of democracy and representation. And yet the way they're actually modeled in the architecture is usually reflective of Rome. And not the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire. So when you actually go and look at most parliamentary buildings throughout the world, they're actually relics of empire, not democracy per se. And so I think that's also an interesting reflection is how power shapes both photography as well as the way we actually see the photographs as well. So that's some very high-level abstract thoughts, but hopefully they're useful in terms of continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Luke. I don't know if anyone wants to respond or react to anything that Luke said, or...
The last question was how power?
Yeah, the last question was along the lines of how power... Yeah, I can do that. My voice is so loud already. The last question was a provocation of how power shapes your actual act of photography, what you pay attention to and what you don't. And additionally, what you have access to and what you don't as a reflection of power. I think the latter you've already spoken about quite a lot, but maybe the former would be interesting to hear more on.
Until recently, until COVID, I was teaching college level, and some of the very best. I was teaching at FIT in New York City, and some of the best photographers that I had were the poorest of them. So they had no power, but they were rather unvarnished in their criticisms of power, in a way that someone who does have power, pick a journalist working for a network, might not have the same freedom or courage to do. And I think that's one of the other reasons that we often look at like unestablished photographers or unestablished artists for what they have to say, because I think by nature they're more honest than maybe I have the capacity to be, because I have dependence. So I might not say some of the same things that I said when I was a little bit younger. But I think that the issue of power in the art world is really fascinating. Go look at the Venice Biennale. Like, how much of that is really subversive and how much of it fits nicely into the power structure? I think it's more of the latter than the former. Which I think is why it's important that we continue, like that we don't get so wrapped up in our own business, those of us who have had, I don't know, a modicum career, and continue to look at younger photographers coming up, because they have a certain vitality that I think by nature we don't have as much anymore, because we have creature comforts and a little luxury here and there.
Thank you, Sean. And I like this, this question of power. That's one of a number of challenges that photographers face. Lois also highlighted the question of language and the challenge of language, and how important language can be, both I think in gaining practical access, but also in understanding the place that you're photographing and understanding the people that you're interacting with. Also maybe convincing them that they want to collaborate with you, which I think is really important. And I was wondering, Andreas, because you've been working a lot outside of, you're working in the United States, you're working in Detroit. That's a really kind of a wildly different environment. I was wondering, maybe in your work, are there particular challenges that maybe we wouldn't anticipate, or what were some of the challenges that you faced working on your Periphery project?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is not to get lost in the city and getting back to the hotel in the evening. Otherwise, it's really, I also really enjoy like just walking through towns and really kind of just being attracted by something, following it, and completely get lost, kind of. So of course, I don't need permission. I just go where I think I can find something, and if someone doesn't like it, I go on. So it's not, I don't really insist in something that, because the thing is, when I see something that could be a nice image, like my experience is that you put in so much images that you already have in your head, so that always the expectations are so high that you can only be disappointed when you have the result. So actually the best pictures emerge when you're tired and you're like, you put up the tripod and you're like, okay, fuck it, I'll do it. So, and then I go home, and because you don't expect anything, and then you have this like positive surprise that it was really worth doing it, you know. Yeah, I mean, of course, I also go to places that are not nice places. Of course, like people ask you, why are you coming here? Because sometimes they're afraid of, I mean, it's not that it's really poor, but of course it's like places that are notorious, so they don't like that you go there because they think you're a journalist and you put them on a bad place again, because yeah, and of course you have bad experiences that yeah, people don't like. But as I said, I have no like image in my head that I think I need to have it. So I just go on and go somewhere else, because I think there are enough places that are interesting enough to where there's no one, and I have my calm and I can do what I want. So.
I agree with you. I mean, that's because of photography, it's always a meeting, with the person, but also with nature. This is the reason why often we are alone when we go, because the surprise of the meeting with the landscape or with the person, it's. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ludovica, do you feel, a lot of your work, we didn't talk so much about it yet, but touches on questions related to women and to child brides, and your new work, Inner Alchemy, is also about women's rights. I'm wondering, is there, do you react to this in any way?
React to? What do you mean, to react
to this kind of, for you, is there an element of a serendipity in your work, or how are you finding the subjects of your work? How are you approaching your projects?
Well, of course, I have to be involved somehow. So when I talk about something, I mean, women, of course, because I am one, and I face problems in society regarding my identity. What should I do? What should I be? How should I act in public? But also, I think I have a lot of, inheritance, like even genetic from mother, grandmas, and history talks a lot in a silent way of how women were totally excluded from being remembered or from having themselves in the contributing really into society. And this is something that hit me because I think I felt some of these issues really about my family, really about my grandmas, which were so bright, they were so smart, but still they couldn't accomplish anything else apart family and sewing clothes for us. This was actually somehow painful for me. Also, my grandma, I mean, she was more aware of robotics than me. She was so interested in contemporary society, and I admired her a lot. This is why in the new work I'm doing, I am actually combining also objects I took from them, something they were sewing or working on. They were so good and became professional about this, but it's an unpaid profession since the 16th century, I guess. There is actually a wonderful book about this by Professor Silvia Federici, Caliban and the Witch. I don't know if you read it. I suggest it because it's a very interesting narration about how capitalism and enslavement of black people and women was necessary to develop the society we have today. And this was very interesting to me. So there is always some biographical aspect, but maybe I try to connect it with the more global aspects.
Thank you. So I think as a kind of concluding remark, we've talked. I promised Lois I would come back to this, so I'm going to come back to it because I would like to talk about this fact and fiction question, and I think we could conclude on that. I've really enjoyed, actually, thank you to each of you because you have such a different photographic practice and such a different approach, and I think it's very representative in how Bill and I also conceived this exhibition, to be inclusive of different career stages, of different ways of making photographs, and I hope that it'll be a very interesting experience for the visitors who can come to see the show to discover each of your works. So Lois, we just, to come back to this idea of fact and fiction, because often when we do guided tours, there is a question that comes up that I think is very, very interesting. There's always this question of, but do you prefer black and white to color photography? Why is there so much color photography? And actually, your work is one of the few black and white images in the show. And when we were walking through yesterday, we were looking at all of the other photographs, and it was really wonderful to speak with you about which ones really touched you from the other artists. But you said that you had always found that your approach and the black and white images that you were making, very well known for your platinum prints, that they were the perfect way for you to explore this idea of fact and fiction. And I just wanted to know if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that with us.
That's a long talk. You have the fact, and you know, that's what inspires you, or maybe you're inspired by some fiction of a fact that you're thinking about. But I think that, as soon as you reduce the world to a flat surface, you are making a fiction already. You're making a fiction by where you stand. If you're a war photographer, something can be going on over there. People can be having tea over there. And, it's like, it's a hard thing to really define, but I look at it as fiction because you're telling your story. Everything is, like, I think all art is like a self-portrait. And, because you have your history, everybody's history is different. If we go out and we both photograph in New York, and I was looking at his work, and you know, it's just like, I don't look at New York, I look at New York differently. And that's great. I think that's really wonderful. But that's, you know, what is the fact? The fact is, you know, the Flatiron Building standing there, you know, but with different light, it's transformed even without you photographing it, right? So, yeah, I think it's like a very long conversation, but it's something I try to get my students to also think about. And yeah, it's the photograph is not a fact. You want to speak to that?
Ooh. I feel like that's actually a very good note.
I think that's actually a really nice point to end on. Thank you, Lois, and thank you, Sean, Nicola, Andreas, Ludovica, and Luke.